and hand over the session to our friends here.
Thank you very much, Charles, and hi, everybody. So I'm Molly Penn. I'm the founder of Penn Creative Strategy. Our firm is a consulting firm based in New York City. We work on strategy, organizational development, and inclusion and equity services with nonprofits and foundations of all different kinds. And then in the last year and a half, we have run grant writing cohorts for LenFest for journalist organizations 4 times. So they asked us to come to this summit and kind of distill it all into, because we ran them they were 5 different sessions. Each session was an hour for each cohort, and then times 4. And so we had to distill all that down to 1 hour. So this is going to be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, but hopefully we'll have some fun. And I'm just going to pass the mic to my colleague Marissa to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm on mute. I'm Marissa Lewis. I joined Penn Creative Strategy probably a year and a half ago, after 20 years in the nonprofit sector, more than 20 years in the nonprofit sector, primarily in fundraising, but with some pit stops in grant making. So I've been on both sides of the equation, and hopefully I can draw on that experience to give you some helpful information today.
Great. And I see we already have a question in there.
Yeah.
Just 1 second. Yeah, we're going to get to your question. If we don't, Aurora, please ask it again. But I think we're going to cover your question about in the middle of our workshop today. So just hang in there. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. And basically, this is just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about with you today. It really falls into kind of 3 main areas. There's research, which is really about how do you figure out who to approach for funding and how to find them. And then there's making the case and supporting the story. So that's the actual grant writing piece, right? How do you talk about your work and how it supports and enriches your community? And then relationship building, because grant writing, we'll get more into this in a little while, but grant writing is not just submitting a paper application or an online application and then leaving it at that. It really involves relationship building. So we're going to cover all of those pieces today, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the end. All right. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, grant writing is really a cycle. We talk about it as grant writing, but it starts with the research. It goes through writing the proposal or making the pitch, getting funded, and then there's reporting on what you did with the funds. And then it starts all over again. So as you can see, the actual writing piece is only at the very bottom of this circle. And it's one step in a fairly long process that repeats itself every year or so. Usually it's a year, but sometimes you get multi-year grants that would be a little longer, but it's a whole cycle of activities. So we're going to start by looking at the research piece first, because that's really where you start. So in the funnel on this slide, you'll see some of the things that really should guide your research to find the right funding sources for your project. So it starts with knowing your project. What kind of project is it? What will it cost? Kind of what's involved in it, right? And from there, you want to find the funders for whom that kind of project fits their guidelines, or where they have what we call demonstrated interest, meaning it may not fit their stated guidelines, but they may have funded other projects just like that in the past. And so if you know that they've funded something like that in the past, then there is the possibility that they'll fund you too, even if you don't perfectly fit their guidelines. So to find some of these funders, there are a couple of pretty common search websites that you can use. The first is on the upper left there. It's called Candid. And it's really the foundation directory online within Candid. And that is a subscription service. It is a massive national clearinghouse of every foundation, their funding areas, their grant amounts, where they give geographically, what their guidelines are. It's kind of the gold standard of grant directories. And it's the oldest and most comprehensive. So it used to be an actual live library in New York City. I'm actually not even sure it is anymore. I think it's only online now. And so because it's the gold standard, the cheapest subscription is about $199 a month. So it's pretty expensive. You could just get a month or two though, and do all of your research in that month or two. Or in some cases, you can check your local library, because often the public library has a subscription to the Foundation Center. So that's a possibility also. So that's one of them. The other one on the upper right side of the funnel is called Instrumental, which is more like outsourcing your grants management. That's like a one-stop shop. So they'll do the research for you. They'll generate a list of prospects, and then they'll create a calendar and remind you of all the deadlines. They could even write the proposals for you. I mean, so there's, they can do as much or as little as you need them to, but if you just need the research piece, they can help you with that. And then the really free option is Google. You can just Google a bunch of different foundations or funders of X, or go on the websites of other organizations who've gotten grants for similar projects and see who's funding them, and then look up those foundations. So there's a whole bunch of ways that you can kind of do this guerrilla research, right? And then if none of that works, there's other avenues. You can look, most communities have a community foundation. So if you go to your community foundation, that can be a good resource of who are the funders in this area who fund, geographically in this proximity. And they might be able to help, you identify some of the funders that way. You can also talk to some of your current donors if you have any. There's an old adage, if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. So ask their advice for other funders, and who knows, they may help fund it for you. So there are a whole bunch of ways you can do this research, from very formal and more expensive to the complete freebie options. But it takes a little bit of time to really just sort of thoroughly vet the potential foundations that would be interested in funding your work. So once you've established a list of donors, we can go, Marissa, to the next slide. Thank you. It's really time to figure out kind of who's who. So see if anybody in your orbit knows anybody in their orbit. We tend to think that because foundations are in the business of giving away money, all we have to do is submit an application and we'll get the money. And in fact, like anything else, it is really a relationship building process. People give money to people, not to organizations. So they need to know you in addition to just knowing your organization, kind of both. So there is a little bit, you'll stand the strongest chance if you have some kind of relationship with the prospective funder, rather than just submitting what we call a cold application. So tap into your board, talk to your board and see if they know anybody on their board or on the foundation staff. Talk to your donors, community leaders who know you well. Dig deep, try to see if you know anybody who could potentially connect you to somebody at the foundation. Another way to do that is LinkedIn. I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn because you can see everybody's connections and who they're connected to. So you can research the staff and board members of a particular foundation you want to approach and see if they're may be connected to anyone in your network. And then ask the person in your network to work that connection and make an introduction for you. So really all of that is to say insider contact is the best and fastest way to get your foot in the door with a foundation. You won't always be able to make a connection that way, but when you do, it's really great news and it saves you a lot of time and effort. So let's say you get your foot in the door and they say, great, go ahead and submit an application to us. So now you've done your research, you've identified who you want to target, it's time to tell your story. And this is where we kind of really like to highlight the distinction between grant writing and journalistic writing, right? There are some similarities and there are some differences. In grant writing, we really talk about it as making the case. So it is really persuasive writing, if you will. It's sales. Long story short. Journalistic writing is more expository in nature. And so this is a slightly different style of writing. So in making the case, the first thing you have to do is define why your project is needed. And that's a steep hill to climb, especially in journalism, because we kind of, when we're steeped in our professions, we tend to think, well, of course, journalism is important. And of course, citizens need to be informed in order to create a healthy democracy. But you have to find a way to say that, to articulate that, and to make it compelling to a funder who might be interested in funding you. So sometimes defining the need is also called the problem statement or describing the problem to be solved. We really advise people to resist the urge to focus on the negative. We don't want to talk about what the kids don't have in this poor neighborhood or what the community lacks. But what we can say is these people are talented, amazing, valuable community members. What they could use more of is, and this is opportunity, resources, information, access, whatever it is. So that's one part, defining the need. The next piece is really what you plan to do to address the need. So specifically, what is your project or plan and how is that tailored to address the need that exists in the community? And then third, why are you the right organization to do this work? Why you over any other journalistic entity that may be in your geographic area or in that same community? So here you might talk about your experience, your journalistic excellence, that you're well known and respected and trusted in the community as an information source. You might talk about awards that you've won, anything that can attest to the validity and the expertise of your journalistic entity would be appropriate there. And then you talk about how will you assess your success, how effective you were. You set out to do this project. The project is based on a need. So did you actually address that need? How did your project make a difference? And so that's a whole piece of the case as well, is really being able to articulate what you're going to measure or how you're going to know that your work made a difference. And what is that difference that you're hoping to see as a result of your work? So these are all the kind of components of making the case. So let's go to the next slide. And this is really where most writing, grant writing and journalistic writing kind of starts to converge. There's a story arc, as there is in any good writing, right? So you need to give us a protagonist or a group of protagonists. So these could be whoever it is that you're writing about is basically the protagonist. It could be a swath of people in your community, or it could be some individual person, or it could be a small group of people, whatever it is. Show us what makes them relatable and what they want. Tell us about the major conflict they face or the barrier they face. Connect your project or your organization to helping them overcome that conflict. And then the resolution is, how will you know you've succeeded? So I'm going to actually give you a little handout here in the chat. I'm actually going to give you two handouts. The first one is this one. And it is a story exercise. So it's just a little cheat sheet that you can use to start thinking about what are the different elements of your story arc in thinking about writing this proposal. And then the second handout is a template for writing a grant proposal, which will be a very helpful starting point if you don't have a lot of experience with grant writing. It just gives you kind of the layout of a very common type of grant proposal. Now, every foundation sometimes has different layouts that they want, but those are the basic you'll eventually be asked to hit all those basic questions. So if you can kind of work on them in the template, you have something ready to go and upload, or you can upload pieces of it in the right order, whatever it is. So now we're going to talk to you a little bit about letters of inquiry. So if you think about the old days, when a young woman came of age, her gentleman caller would have to submit a request in writing to be granted permission to come and spend time with her, supervised, chaperoned by her family. And so the same tradition actually holds in grant writing. It's a little bit like theater. Before you apply, you have to audition. They want to make sure you look the part, that you have some acting chops, same thing with grants. Basically, what they're trying to do is save themselves the time of having to read 30 different, 10-page grant applications. If yours is going to be way off the mark or really clearly not a good fit, they don't want to have to wade through all of it to get to the point of saying, no, this isn't right. So they'd rather get a quick 2-pager from you that says, here's what I'm basically after, so they can make sure it makes sense for them to entertain the full proposal from you. So that's really what the letter of inquiry is called, also known as an LOI. And so a lot of funders will ask you for that in advance of submitting an actual application. So here's the format for an LOI, and it's a fairly standard format. You start with an introduction, and that's really strong and clear. It's where you lay out the parameters of what you'll be asking the foundation to support. Who are you? What is the project? What is the budget? How does it fit their guidelines, etc.? So it's kind of like the summary paragraph. Then you get into a description of really who you are, like a broader description of who you are. Talk about why the project is needed. You didn't just make it up. There's some reason why this is an important project to do now. Talk about your approach, how you're going to go about addressing that need, and why your approach is different or better or unique or particularly suited to this. You also, this is a good place to talk about if you're approaching other funders or you have other funding lined up. Grant foundations often want to know that they are not the only person funding your project, or at least not the only person funding your organization. So they really need to know that there are other people involved, and that helps give them a kind of stamp of approval, an imprimatur, that other funders have seen that this is a legitimate project and worth funding. And then at the end, you kind of summarize all of that and express your gratitude for their consideration. Now, some people like to write the full grant proposal first and then distill it to a letter of inquiry. Other people like to write the letter of inquiry first and use that as a kind of outline that they can flesh out into the full proposal. You'll have to determine whatever works for you. So we can go to the checklist. We're going to show you a little sample checklist just to kind of vet your LOI, make sure you've covered all your bases. And then I'm going to give you in the chat another handout, which is a sample letter of inquiry that we put together to give you a sense of kind of what a strong letter of inquiry really looks like. So again, you can save this into your files and hang on to it after the workshop today as a point of reference. And with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Marissa.
Hey, everyone. You've written your LOI, you've made your case. And you all know that as writers, it can be difficult to, be pithy and, be succinct, but still convey a lot of information that is nuanced and rich, right? That's what grant writing is, right? You will have other materials, chiefly your budget, to kind of flesh out that story. So you don't have to rely entirely on your narrative, because please never, never, never forget, you're asking for money, right? So we're going to talk about budget here. on this slide, we see some tips, right, for how to create like a nice budget. We know that they look really rudimentary, they look really just basic, right? But we put them here because many people forget about them. As a grant writer, as a seasoned grant writer, I have committed all of these sins. I have done all of these things wrong. And as a grant maker, I have received budgets in like varying degrees of disarray, right? So it's important to just, they're basic, but they bear repeating. So you want to make sure that everything in this gorgeous narrative that you have just woven is reflected in your budget, and vice versa. Number one, don't budget too little, especially for staff time. This work that you are doing is work, right? Don't underestimate how much manpower it's going to take, either in terms of the number of people working on it or the number of hours spent on it. Underestimating it shortchanges you, but it sort of makes you look inexperienced, like you don't really know, the cost of things. If you're asking for general operating support for your organization as a whole, you should include everyone that makes your organization run in that. And don't forget benefits. Number two, make sure that everything in your budget is in the proposal narrative. Here, you don't have to get down to the pens and pencils, but if there is a significant line item that is represented in your budget, make sure that you're talking about it in the narrative. And if you're talking at length about a significant element of your project, make sure that that element is budgeted for here. You don't want any surprises in the budget. You don't want anything that doesn't make sense in terms of how you tell your story. Number three, double check your math, double check your math, double check your math. It needs to be repeated. Make sure it adds up, make sure it adds up, down, and sideways. Use Excel or some other like spreadsheet program that does the math for you, and try to have someone else eyeball it before you submit it. So someone who didn't write it can understand it. And finally, align the budget to the narrative and the timeline. Excuse me. Explaining what things cost is related to when and for how long you're going to do that thing, right? So include that in here. It all goes hand in hand. You're going to be spending this amount of money for this thing over this period of time. Be clear about what you need. Don't be shy about it, but back it up. All of this information that's included in your budget is how you show that you know what you're doing, that what you're proposing is based on experience and based on knowledge that you have a firm grip on. It also provides the grant maker, the funder, with some really important data points, like Molly said, like how much of the total cost am I being asked to support? And who else is chipping in for this? There are some questions that the funder is going to have in the back of their mind when they're looking at your budget, right? In fact, to partially answer the original question, a lot of times funders will go from your cover letter straight to the budget and then read the proposal, right? Once they make sure, they'll read the proposal once they make sure everything makes sense. They don't want to spend time reading your proposal if your budget is off. So if it doesn't add up, or if there's some other issue that's giving them pause, it might just make them think that you are not experienced. So they're going to look at the budget first. So some of the questions are, does it fit within our general range of giving, right? Is this grant larger or smaller than our normal grant, right? You want to be in the range because if nothing else, it shows that you've read the guidelines and that you are familiar with them and with their work. Also, if maybe you're asking for a little bit more than they're used to giving, this is where the relationship building comes in, right? You've already talked about it. This is not going to be a surprise to them. Is it consistent with the instructions? Again, has this person read the guidelines? Is the budget consistent with the narrative? Are the line item calculations specific and based on estimates? They just want to know, are the numbers based on something, or do they feel made up, right? Or do they feel like speculation? They want to know how you arrived at these figures. And again, experience is the best teacher. We've done this before, or we've done something similar to this before. This is how much we pay for X service or product or whatever. Are expenses justified? Of course, back everything up. And really the main question they're going to be asking themselves is, will the proposed budget be a good social investment, right? They want to know, because again, this is their full-time job, is to take money and give it to people to achieve a good thing. They want to know that their amount of money isn't just going to be a drop in the bucket, like it's really going to help you achieve a good social outcome. Be cost effective for sure, but more importantly, you want to show that your budget and your project are well thought out. They're based on experience, they're based on reality, and that you know how to apply the money effectively towards this positive outcome. Okay, so you've submitted your proposal, you've submitted your budget, and you get an envelope in the mail, right? Or more likely, you get an email. And it's a tense moment, right? Did you get it or didn't get it? It also tends to be an emotional moment because we've done a lot of work for just the possibility of funding, right? So it takes effort and thought and planning. And so you get this, envelope. It's like the college acceptance. Is it the fat envelope or the skinny envelope? Here we're going to share, here on this slide, we're going to share some tips on guiding you through the process, guiding you through the emotions, but also some practical steps in getting or not getting the grant. So we have two possible outcomes, right? Either it was accepted or it was rejected. And there are specific things to do whether you get the grant or not. If your proposal was accepted, if you have been granted, you want to write a thank you note within 48 hours of receiving the check, for sure. Oftentimes you'll get a note, an email, a letter saying you're approved, and then the check comes a month later. So you want to, thank them for the approval, but definitely thank them for the actual receipt of the money. In this thank you, you want to be specific. We received a check in this amount on this date. They need that for their record keeping. But also in this document, you want to remind them of what we're all doing here, right? Remind them of the details. It was this amount of money for this project that's going to take place over this period of time, and it's going to achieve this thing. Just it keeps them engaged and reminds them of what they're funding. You want to include an offer to visit you or your project or your newsroom. We'll get into that in a minute. They'll either say yes or no. And if you can, you want to close off with a personal note, handwritten, if it's a paper letter, even if it's just thanks so much, or can't wait to get started. But you want it to be from a person to a person. If we move over to the right-hand side, if you received a rejection, again, don't take it personally, right? They get a lot more requests than they can fund. And sometimes they get more requests than they can even process, right? So there could be a number of process or administrative reasons why your proposal didn't advance or why it didn't get the attention it deserved. My old colleague used to say, no just means not now, right? And this is especially true if the relationship building efforts are ongoing. So it's not that they didn't like you maybe it's just that they couldn't get to you now. You also want to follow up a rejection letter with a prompt acknowledgement while you're still fresh in their mind. You don't want to fade from their memory. Thank them for their time, their consideration of the proposal, and ask for feedback, right? Maybe ask, why we didn't get funded. They will either say yes or no to providing the feedback. If they say yes, this is a golden opportunity, right? If they say yes, number one, it means they still like you and they still want to help you. But they're also, if they're willing to share their insights and their thoughts about your proposal, the strengths and weaknesses, listen to what they have to say and use it to be better next time. If you receive the rejection, you want to invite them also for a visit, right? Why not? Invite them to something, invite them to an event, a meeting, anything. You want some face time. If they come and visit with you, again, golden, ask for advice. Remember what Molly said, if you want money, ask for advice. Because again, this means they're still sort of into you, if they want to come talk to you. Keeping the relationship open keeps the door open, right? So again, no means not now. Whoops. So whether it's an acceptance or a rejection, your job here is to parlay that into a continued professional relationship. This is a person in my field who I know now, and maybe that can lead to some funding. We are sharing, yes, in the chat, there's a link to a template letter to send if you receive the funding, and a template letter to send if your application was rejected, covering all of these bases. So now, for the purposes of sort of nurturing the relationship, we're going to assume you got the grant, although, these are things you can do to continue building the relationship with a funder who declined you, depending on the genuineness of the relationship. So, now you got the grant. Now you're in something real. You're in a real relationship. You want every interaction to leverage this grant into the next grant, or even this grant into an introduction to a potential other grant from another funder, because that happens. Funders talk. There are going to be plenty of moments for formal connections, like you're going to have to report on what's happening in your project, either through an internal report or a final report or both. But outside of that, there are plenty of potential connection points. You want to make sure you communicate early and often, and let the information flow both ways, right? The worst time to reach out to a funder is when you have to, right? Either there's a deadline or there's something bad happened. Let them know what's going on with you, but also ask them what's going on with them. Let it be two ways. Don't wait for reporting deadlines. Reach out whenever there's a win. We reached our first milestone. We hired the first, writer. We completed the first round of interviews. Whatever it is, if there's a win, let them know. Send them an email. If there's an item of interest to report in the project or in the field, let them know. If you hit a roadblock, if you hit a challenge, absolutely let them know. That's never super pleasant, but you never want to surprise them with bad news at the end of the funding cycle. In your final report, you don't want to list a bunch of things that kept you from completing, your task. And again, this thing happened. We're not sure we're going to be able to complete task X in the way that we said. Ask for some advice. What can we do? What should we do? There are always ways around it. And even if it didn't totally derail your project, they want to know this is how journalistic pursuits work. Sometimes challenges happen. Invite them to everything. Public events, fundraisers, for sure. But also, like if you or someone on your staff or someone on your board is speaking at a conference, or they're on a panel about a topic that's interesting to the funder, invite them to that. Like, invite them. They'll say no most of the time, a lot of the time, but they like to be invited. They like to be invited to things. And if they say yes, again, golden opportunity, take advantage of it and be authentic within it. Again, if you're lucky, your funders will want to visit you. And if they do, it's a good chance to build a relationship, but it's really the program officer gathering information. They have to gather information to make recommendations to their bosses for whether to fund you or to continue funding you. The thing that's important, another thing that's important to note here, specifically for the type of work that you do, that if funders are coming to see you work, you have to give careful thought and consideration to how you communicate, like the sanctity of your editorial content, right? Meaning, yeah, come through. You can come see us work. You can come see how the sausage is made, but you may not influence what we report on, how we report on it, when we report on it, anything like that. And most funders will know this, but it's good for you to keep it front of mind as well, especially, if for example, if I'm a health funder and this is my first funding of a journalistic pursuit and it's a series on COVID, it makes perfect sense that I would fund this, but I might not know enough about the journalistic process to know what I can affect and not affect. So I don't think anyone's going to push back on it, but it's important that it be said, and that it be said out loud, and that it be understood. In fact, if we looked at the next slide, LenFest has created a policy. It's a gift acceptance policy. We see it screenshotted here. And it's a really good example. It's a really good best practice for setting appropriate boundaries with funders. Again, particularly important in certain industries, journalism, being among them. That brings us to power dynamics, right? Just like a global sort of statement about the nonprofit sector and philanthropy in general, there's a very uneven power dynamic in philanthropy, right? They have the money, we want it. The best funders, the very best funders, will at least recognize that dynamic and try to navigate it in a way that is helpful for everyone. The worst ones, either aware or unaware, on purpose or unconsciously, they're going to make you jump through hoops to get that money. And while they're making you jump through hoops, they want you to make them feel like you're in an authentic relationship, right? It's a sort of a self-perpetuating loop that happens. So organizations with the capacity to jump through the hoop, right? We have a development team. We have we have someone tracking our outcomes. We have a writer. We have all of these things. We have the capacity to jump through the hoop, so we get the funding. While other organizations who need the money just as much, right, but maybe don't have the staff or the time or the resources or the experience to get funded, don't get funded. That's how the power dynamic has been traditionally. But on the plus side, recently, both funders and nonprofits have started to work together to kind of balance that out. For example, there's a movement called TrustBased Philanthropy, right? Where it's not assumed that the funder knows what's best because they have the money, right? Trust-based philanthropy is also about lowering the barriers between you and the funders and making it less effortful for you to apply for funding. Funders are also becoming slowly more open to giving general operating support, which is what a lot of organizations need. Like, I don't really need the funder to tell me, what project is more important than another project. I do need the lights to stay on though, right? Funders are starting to give more multi-year general operating support and trusting that the nonprofit can execute their mission. The nonprofit can do the work, right? So we encourage you to check this out. There's a website and a blog, you can subscribe to it. We will be sharing links to resources about this if you really want to geek out on the world of power and privilege and colonization and philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. So we're going to share a resource list for that. We bring up the power dynamic because, for a variety of reasons, but it can be really rhetorically attractive to want to be scrappy and we can do more with less. That's not how that works. You can't do more with less, you do less with less. So we're slowly trying to trend away from that too. So in writing your narrative, in creating your budget, resource up, staff up, and let's acknowledge that this work is work and that it costs money and not be embarrassed or feel inadequate, and not wear being burnt out as like a badge of honor. So rant over. I think I would like to thank you for your time, for listening to me go on, and invite questions. Let's open up the Q&A.
You got a rant appreciated.
It's hard work. It needs to be said.
It does indeed. So I do want to circle back and just say to Aurora, did we answer your question? And I see some appreciative words in the chat. Can you hire companies to do the oversight of the grant? I'm not sure what kind of oversight you mean.
And after that, Henry has his hand up.
Oh, great. I wonder if we can, I'm just trying to see if we can get out of spotlight mode so we can actually talk to each other.
Yeah.
Gallery.
I can't really see
There you
anything.
go.
Okay.
So Henry,
reporting and documenting. Are we allowed to come off mute? Like Martha, would you like to come off mute and explain what you mean by reporting and documenting?
I just came off mute. We're a for-profit community newspaper who I think functions a lot like a not-for-profit, but we don't have necessarily the staffing, to do that kind of reporting and oversight. So could we hire some experts that maybe could come in and reassure a funder that they're looking at our books, that they are making sure that, we have that kind of support to give them, I think, probably the confidence that we won't spend the money willy-nilly. I mean, we wouldn't, but, and we do have a bookkeeper, but we don't have maybe perhaps that kind of, I don't know if they would need reviewed financials or audited financials, that would be very expensive. Is there a way around that to give them confidence?
Not that I know of, and I think you're highlighting something that would be kind of interesting to just give a little background on for everybody else on the call, which is that some of you are for-profit companies and some of you are nonprofit companies. Nonprofit companies, their financials are public information and they're easily accessible, so any foundation can go to something called GuideStar and look up your tax returns and know more about your financials. And so that gives them a measure of confidence. So I think that's what Martha's asking about here is when you're a private corporation, not a nonprofit, you don't have to disclose your books to anyone. And so how do they know that you're doing the right kind of bookkeeping on this? And I think, unfortunately, an audit would probably be required in that instance. Marissa, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know that for-profit, I know a lot less about for-profit entities, but I know that in the nonprofit sector, like they're not sort of reviewing your books to the extent that you would review the books of a for-profit. Like they're just going to look at your 990 and your audited financials and things like that if you're above a certain size. But that stuff is expensive. Like I don't know that there's a way to outsource that where it's not expensive. In terms of reporting and documenting the work, though, I think that ideally, the person who wrote the proposal and the person doing the work worked together to submit the request. And those are the people who should sort of report on what happened. And I can't answer knowledgeably if your bookkeeper can report on what happened fiscally. Let's go to Henry, and then we'll read Sharon.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for this course. It was really great. And you both touched on a few things that like really hit home for our organization, because we received a big operating budget grant, which is basically like, here's money to keep operating, keep moving forward. And our biggest expense is staffing. So our steps now is trying to figure out how to like leverage that, big grant they gave us to try to apply to more focused grants to maybe, fill the gap. And you mentioned COVID-19 grants, which we applied to, gotten. So we're just trying to keep the ball rolling. And my question was, for applying for like big operational grants and then applying for maybe more focused grants that can help build your budget, do you have any kind of like tips or experience in how you might want to approach those two differently?
So let's back up a second for the benefit of your colleagues on this call. What Henry is pointing out is that there are two different kinds of support you can get from foundations. One is called general operating, or otherwise known as unrestricted support, meaning that they're not telling you what to spend it on. You can spend it on anything you want, rent, whatever it is that you want. And then the other type is project-based support or restricted funding, which means that they're saying, we are funding this particular project because that's what you asked us for. And so the money has to be used only for that. So I think one answer to your question is the really easy answer, right? When you're writing an application for general operating support, you are talking about your entire organization. So that's really the subject of your proposal. Whereas when you're writing about you're trying to get restricted funding, you are talking about a project you want to do. And so that's really the difference in the focus of the application that you're writing. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking, though. It feels like that's a very easy answer.
If I can add, when you're writing about general operating support, and you're talking about your organization as a whole, you can talk a lot more about, this is why we exist. This is the social problem we're trying to attack, in sort of bigger terms than you would for this project is going to accomplish this specific thing. It's helping us, meet the greater mission, for sure. Everything is mission based, but it's a piece of it, whereas general operating support is sort of bigger philosophically. We have some questions in the chat about impact. Oh man, these are hard questions.
I know. I'm actually digging into our files from the cohort programs we ran for LearnFest to get some of those handouts.
So we talked a lot about impact and first of all, what kind of impact you even have the capacity to measure. Well, let's go question by question. In terms of what kind of impact makes a difference to funders, that depends on the funder. Some funders are like, did you do the thing? That's great. You've met your impact. Others, want you to change hearts and minds. And you know, an example being like we ran a series on lung cancer, and the smoking rates in our community dropped by X%. Like some want a big hit. Some are satisfied with number of people, like the number of actual engagements, the number of eyes who read this story. And yeah, all of the above. It depends on the funder. It depends on I think the most important thing is that you should decide what impact you are trying to make and communicate it that way. Not try to measure something they're asking you to measure because they asked you to measure it, but it's really part of what you're trying to do. So if you're not trying to, get everyone vaccinated, then don't promise that you're going to get everyone vaccinated. Just say we're going to provide the information about vaccination to X number of people in this community. I'm not sure if that makes sense. It's a really prickly, difficult question to answer. But number of views, number of clicks, number of downloads is always, it's always a good thing to be measuring, because it's like this thing was popular, this thing was consumed, this thing reached a lot of people. Molly, help me out.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did it. I'm here. I think oh, you know what? Here's one resource for you. I'm putting a book by a friend of ours, a colleague and friend of ours. In the chat on how to do outcome measurement if you're not an evaluator, a professional evaluator. Like she makes it really simple.
And actually, to go back to Martha's question, there are companies or consulting firms or companies that you can hire who will do the evaluation and the measurement for you. They're expensive, but a lot of times rightfully so. It's not something I would do on like a project by project basis to have someone come in and evaluate every project. But if you wanted to say, for the past 5 years, we've done X number of stories on this topic, let's see how that went. That might be something you want to invest in. Yeah, Sharon and Britton, I don't know if that answers your question.
And I am putting all of these links in our Google Doc with notes. And I also put our emails at the top of that. So if you have continuing questions after this workshop, please email us, because we have lots of resources we can share.
I moved to the resource list, but this is a prettier picture, so I'm going to leave this up. Anyone else? Anything else? What did we miss?
Looks like we're just about done.
All right. I wanted to thank Molly, Marissa, and Penn Creative Strategy for the super informative presentation and workshop. I think everyone in the chat is saying thank you. They're really thankful for that. I hope all of you guys can enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks for coming by. I'll end this recording and the session. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.